decisions of the WTO regarding direct taxes. How does the United States tax foreign earnings and investment, and how does that compare to best practices around the world? What are the trends in tax policy and in tax and treaties on taxation? What are the best norms in terms of tax fairness and tax efficiency related to business? Have there been any recent studies that you should be aware of? What are the role of statutes in this field? Executive orders, regulations, what are the role of courts in tax and competitiveness? And finally, what's at stake in the U.S. elections on this issue? So these are some questions I'll throw out there. I don't know to what extent our speakers are planning on covering any of those, but if any of those intrigue you, you might want to ask questions of it in the question period. We have two experts today. I think Warren is going first, and Warren Payne is a senior advisor at Mayor Brown, and before that served for 8 years as a staffer on the House Ways and Means Committee, including as its policy director, and sometime before that was also a staffer at the International Trade Commission. Gary Huffbauer, to his left, is a senior fellow, Dr. Reginald Jones, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The name Reginald Jones, I think, is an apt one for Gary because he's an electrifying speaker in the intellectual content that he communicates. So I'm happy to moderate that panel. I'm, by the way, from professor at George Washington University Law School, where I teach international trade and business. So let me turn this over to Warren.
Thank you, Steve. I think I'm going to get to some of the things on your list, but I'm not getting to all of them, so we can talk to Ken about having another session. I'm very happy to be here. For the folks that are new to WITA, I will tell you, when I came to Washington to work on international trade for the first time as a research fellow at USTR, which is basically a glorified internship, one of the first things I did was join WITA, and it's been a great relationship with them ever since, and I won't tell you how long ago that was. There is a lot of overlap between tax and trade policy, more than people think. One thing Meredith mentioned in her comments today was the growth of digital. The growth of digital is an issue for trade. It's also a very important and emerging issue for tax, and there's a lot of overlap there. There's a lot of overlap in tax and trade concepts in other areas such as investment, financial services, intellectual property rights. And so you're going to see, hopefully, a little bit of that overlap as we talk through some of the issues today. And interestingly enough, I think some growing tension between the two in terms of philosophically what countries are negotiating in terms of trade obligations vis-a-vis what they're more recently negotiating in terms of tax obligations. Steve talked about the fact that trade is a global market, right? Globalization is a routine and understood part of trade policy. It is, over the last few years, 5-6 years now, much more a focus of tax policy. And it's driven by a lot of different things. It's driven by some issues with respect to international competitiveness that we're going to talk about. And a lot of that comes a lot of the things you read about in the newspaper, about inversions and about foreign acquisitions and about some of the aggressive tax planning that has people sheltering income in other countries. So all of that stems from the competitiveness issue around tax, and what I would argue stems from the fact that on the international side, the U.S. has not kept pace on a policy front and has not put the policy changes in on a tax policy front the way we have been more aggressive on the trade side. Okay, so real basic, what is international tax norms? I will tell you this is a significant oversimplification. We could spend hours on any of these, but I'm just going to give you some baseline knowledge. So broadly, two broad attempts to define how people will tax from an international standpoint. The first is worldwide. Basically, it's the right of the government to tax the income of its citizens, and citizens also means businesses, regardless of where that income is earned. So whether it's earned in the United States or elsewhere, the US government has the right to tax it if it's earned by a US citizen or a US company. Territorial is the flip side of that, where the national jurisdiction only takes the right to tax income earned in its jurisdiction. The current US system is something of a hybrid between the two. It's first and foremost worldwide. We maintain the right to tax income anywhere it's earned, but we provide what's called deferral, where we don't exercise those taxing rights until the income is brought back into the United States. Some of you might read in the paper the $2 trillion trapped overseas, all this money. That's what this is. So a US company will earn income overseas, and then if they bring it back to the United States, they're subject to US tax on it. Well, that creates a pretty powerful incentive never to bring it back. It's what we call the lockout effect in tax. One other thing to keep in mind from a mechanical standpoint is we try to avoid double tax. So when the US company brings that income back, they get a credit where their tax liability in the United States is reduced by the amount of tax they pay in the foreign country. In the next slide, I try and give you a little example. All right, this gets to both how these systems work and gives you an example of what the competitive implications of the two systems are. So again, very oversimplified example. You have a British firm, operates in the United States, earns income in the United States. It pays US tax on the income it's earned in the United States. The rest of that income, the after-tax income, it sends back to the UK, to its parent company, or repatriates however it chooses to do so, and it is not subject to any further tax in Britain, okay? So, not subject to the 20% corporate rate in the UK. The flip side is the current US system, where if a US firm is doing business in Britain, it earns income in Britain, it pays British taxes on the income it earns in Britain, and then it wants to bring that income back to the United States. When it brings that income back to the United States, it's subject to US tax. And in this example, because the UK tax rate is lower than the US tax rate, there's no foreign tax credits to eliminate their residual US tax liability. So they're going to pay a residual tax on that income of 15%, the delta between the UK rate of 20 and the US rate of 35. So, again, an oversimplified example, but I think it should drive home from Steve's point, what's the competitiveness impact of the US tax system? Turns out it's pretty uncompetitive. It puts a US company in a pretty bad position where it is paying oftentimes substantially more tax than their foreign competitors.